At 11:47 p.m. on March 15, 1944, Technical Sergeant David Chen crouched inside the radar shack at RAF Debbdon, watching green blips crawl across his scope while 18 German night bombers headed straight for London. 28 years old, 4 months in England, zero solutions to the problem that was killing Allied pilots every single night. The Luftwaffe had perfected night bombing tactics. Heinkel 100s 11s and Junkers 80s 8s crossed the channel in complete darkness, dropped their payloads, and vanished before Allied fighters could intercept them. British Mosquito night fighters caught maybe one bomber in 10. American P-51 Mustangs, the fastest fighters in the European theater, sat useless on the ground after sunset. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Night fighting required radar-guided interception. P-51s had no radar. German bombers owned the darkness. Chen had been tracking those 18 bombers for 40 minutes. He knew their altitude, their heading, their approximate speed. He could predict exactly where they would be in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. But that information died in his radar shack because no Allied fighter could use it. The P-51 squadrons at Debbdon flew daylight missions only. When the sun went down, the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world became expensive static displays. Chen watched those green blips march toward London and knew that hundreds of civilians would die tonight because he couldn't get his targeting data to the pilots who needed it. 3 days earlier, Chen had been walking past the motor pool when he saw something that would change night fighting forever. A maintenance crew was installing radio equipment in a P-51 Mustang, standard procedure for adding new communications gear. But Chen noticed something the mechanics had missed. The radio antenna mount created exactly the right spacing for a small radar receiver. Not a full radar system like the massive units British Mosquitoes carried. Something simpler, something that could receive targeting data from ground stations instead of generating its own radar picture. Chen had studied electrical engineering at MIT before the war. He understood radio frequencies, signal processing, antenna design. He knew that radar information was just radio waves carrying data. If ground radar could transmit targeting information, and if a fighter could receive that information, then single-engine fighters could hunt at night without carrying heavy radar equipment. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Turn every P-51 into a remote display for ground-based radar systems. But the concept violated every doctrine in the Army Air Force's manual. Night fighting belonged to specialized aircraft with trained radar operators. The P-51 was a day fighter, period. Installing unauthorized radio equipment violated maintenance regulations. Using ground radar to guide single-engine fighters had never been tested, never been approved, never been attempted by any air force anywhere in the world. Chen spent that night calculating radio frequencies and signal strength. The mathematics worked. Ground radar stations could broadcast targeting data on specific frequencies. P-51s could receive that data through modified radio equipment. The pilot would see bearing, range, and altitude information on a simple display mounted in his cockpit. No complex radar interpretation required, just basic numbers showing where the enemy was located. The next morning, Chen found squadron leader James Mitchell in the pilot's ready room. Mitchell commanded the 334th Fighter Squadron, flew 73 combat missions, shot down 11 German aircraft in daylight combat. He was also losing friends to night bombers that his squadron couldn't touch. Mitchell listened to Chen's explanation without interrupting. When Chen finished, Mitchell asked one question: "How fast can you build it?" Chen said he needed 3 days, some radio components, and one P-51 that wouldn't be missed if the modification failed catastrophically. Mitchell said he had a war-weary Mustang that was due for major maintenance anyway, aircraft 44-14017. If Chen's modification destroyed the airplane, the paperwork would list it as a maintenance accident. If the modification worked, Mitchell would test it himself the next time German bombers crossed the channel. Chen worked alone in a maintenance hangar for 72 hours straight. He pulled radio components from damaged aircraft. He hand-wound antenna coils using copper wire salvaged from engine harnesses. He built a simple display unit using parts from a broken radio compass. The entire system weighed 11 pounds and cost approximately $47 in scavenged components. The theory was straightforward. RAF radar stations at Dover, Rye, and Poling could track German bombers crossing the channel. Those stations would broadcast targeting data on a specific frequency. Chen's receiver would pick up that data and display it on a small screen in the P-51's cockpit. The pilot would see green dots representing enemy aircraft, along with numbers showing bearing, range, and relative altitude. Simple enough for any pilot to understand, complex enough to guide night interceptions. Installing the system required modifying the P-51's electrical system, mounting the receiver behind the pilot's seat, running antenna leads through the wing structures, and connecting the display to the instrument panel. Chen worked through 2 nights without sleep, His hands were steady despite exhaustion. His calculations were precise despite fatigue. He understood that 18 bombers were crossing the channel every night while he bent over circuit diagrams and soldered connections. On March 18th, Chen powered up the system for the first time. The display flickered to life. Green lines swept across a small circular screen. Numbers appeared in the corners showing frequency settings and signal strength. Chen tuned the receiver to RAF Dover's radar frequency. Immediately, green dots appeared on his screen. Friendly aircraft on training flights. The system was receiving radar data from 30 miles away. Mitchell arrived at the hangar that afternoon. He climbed into the modified P-51, studied the new display mounted beside his flight instruments. The screen was small, maybe 3 inches across. The green dots moved slowly as Dover's radar tracked aircraft in the area. Numbers at the bottom showed bearing and range to each contact. Mitchell asked Chen to explain how it worked. Chen pointed at a green dot on the screen. That dot represented a training flight from RAF Hornchurch, 12 miles northeast at 8,000 feet. Mitchell looked out his canopy, saw nothing. The afternoon was clear, visibility unlimited, but 12 miles was too far to see another aircraft with the naked eye. Chen adjusted the receiver's range setting. The dots on the screen moved closer to the center. Now the display showed aircraft within 6 miles. One dot appeared almost directly ahead. Mitchell looked forward and spotted a Spitfire crossing their airfield at pattern altitude. The system worked. Ground radar was painting a picture of the sky, transmitting that picture by radio, and Chen's receiver was displaying it in real time inside the P-51's cockpit. Mitchell could see aircraft that were invisible to his eyes. He could see their exact bearing, their precise range, their relative altitude. For the first time in aviation history, a single-engine fighter pilot had a radar picture without carrying radar equipment. Mitchell shut down the engine and climbed out. He told Chen the modification was brilliant. Then he told Chen it was also completely unauthorized, potentially catastrophic if it failed during flight, and absolutely essential for winning the night war. Mitchell said he would test the system that evening if German bombers appeared. If it worked, he would recommend immediate adoption across the entire fighter group. If it failed, Chen would face court-martial for unauthorized modification of military aircraft. Chen said he understood the risks. He also said that 18 bombers had crossed the channel last night while P-51s sat on the ground. The mathematics were simple. Court-martial was better than letting civilians die because fighters couldn't hunt in darkness. That evening at 10:23 p.m., RAF Dover reported 18 contacts crossing the French coast inbound toward London. Heinkel 111s flying at 12,000 feet, speed approximately 180 miles per hour. The bombers would reach London in 47 minutes unless intercepted. British Mosquito night fighters were scrambling, but they were based 90 miles north. They wouldn't reach the intercept point in time. Mitchell started his P-51's engine. Chen's display came alive immediately. Green dots appeared on the screen representing the incoming bomber formation. Numbers showed bearing 110 degrees, range 78 miles, altitude 12,000 feet. Mitchell called the tower for takeoff clearance. The controller asked his mission. Mitchell said he was testing new equipment. The controller cleared him for local flight, remain below 15,000 feet, return in 90 minutes. Mitchell took off at 10:31 p.m. The night was clear, temperature 38 degrees, wind calm. Perfect conditions for night fighting if you could find the enemy. Mitchell climbed to 14,000 feet and turned southeast toward the channel. Chen's display showed the bomber formation at bearing 095 degrees, range 52 miles. The numbers changed constantly as both the P-51 and the bombers moved through the sky. At 10:47 p.m., Mitchell reached the intercept point. The display showed contacts at bearing 087 degrees, range 8 miles. Mitchell looked ahead and saw nothing. Complete darkness. No navigation lights, no engine exhaust, no silhouettes against the stars. The German bombers were invisible, but Chen's display showed exactly where they were located. Mitchell turned toward bearing 087 degrees and reduced power to cruise speed. The range decreased steadily. 7 miles, 6 miles, 5 miles. At 4 miles, Mitchell began looking for visual contact. The display showed he was approaching the bomber formation from behind and slightly below. Perfect position for attack if he could see his targets. At 2 miles range, Mitchell spotted them. 18 black shapes against the star field, flying in loose formation toward London. Heinkel 111s, exactly as Dover had reported. Mitchell had found enemy bombers in complete darkness using radar guidance from 70 miles away. No night fighter in history had accomplished this feat. Mitchell selected his closest target, a Heinkel flying slightly separated from the main formation. He closed to 400 yards, lined up his guns, waited for perfect positioning. The German crew had no idea an American fighter was stalking them. Night bombers relied on darkness for protection. They expected no interception over the channel. Mitchell opened fire at 300 yards. 650 caliber machine guns hammered tracers into the Heinkel's left engine. The bomber caught fire immediately. Orange flames streamed backward from the cowling. The aircraft rolled left and began descending toward the channel. Mitchell watched it fall, then turned toward the remaining bombers. But the formation was scattering. The surviving Heinkels had seen their companion burning and were taking evasive action. Some turned back toward France. Others climbed and changed heading. The coordinated bombing attack was broken. London would not burn tonight. Mitchell pursued one more bomber, caught it climbing through 15,000 feet, fired a 4-second burst into its fuselage. The Heinkel exploded in a ball of orange fire. Pieces tumbled through the darkness toward the channel below. Mitchell's first night kills and the first night victories ever scored by a P-51 Mustang. Chen's modification had worked perfectly. Ground radar had provided targeting data. The P-51 had used that data to find invisible enemies. The system had guided successful night interceptions using equipment that cost less than $50 and weighed 11 pounds. Mitchell landed at Debbdon at 11:52 p.m. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold March air. Ground crews surrounded the P-51 as he shut down the engine. They had heard his radio calls reporting 2 confirmed kills, night kills, impossible kills that shouldn't have happened. The squadron intelligence officer was waiting with a clipboard and skeptical expression. Captain Robert Hayes had debriefed hundreds of combat missions. He had never debriefed a night mission flown by a P-51. Hayes asked Mitchell to describe exactly what happened. Mitchell explained Chen's radar receiver, the ground guidance system, the successful interceptions. Hayes wrote everything down, but his expression remained doubtful. Hayes said he needed confirmation. Night combat claims required verification from multiple sources: radar operators, ground observers, recovered wreckage. Without confirmation, the kills couldn't be credited. Mitchell understood. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof. But he also knew that Chen's system had worked exactly as designed. The confirmation came at dawn. RAF Dover reported tracking 2 bomber formations the previous night. The first formation of 18 aircraft had been intercepted over the channel. 2 aircraft were observed falling from formation. The remaining bombers scattered and returned to France without reaching their targets. British coastal observers reported seeing aircraft burning and crashing into the channel, approximately 12 miles southeast of Dover. German radio intercepts provided additional confirmation. Luftwaffe communications mentioned the loss of 2 Heinkel 11s during night operations over England. Both aircraft failed to return to their base in northern France. Cause unknown. No enemy fighters reported in the area. The evidence was conclusive. Mitchell had achieved something that violated every assumption about night fighting. A single-engine day fighter had successfully intercepted enemy bombers in complete darkness using ground radar guidance. The implications were staggering. Colonel Don Blakesley commanded the 4th Fighter Group at Debbdon. He had led more P-51 missions than any pilot in the European theater. He understood fighter capabilities, tactical possibilities, strategic implications. When Hayes briefed him on Mitchell's night mission, Blakesley immediately grasped the significance. If one P-51 could hunt at night using Chen's system, then entire squadrons could hunt at night. The Luftwaffe's sanctuary of darkness would disappear. German night bombers would face the same deadly interception they faced during daylight hours. The strategic balance of night warfare would shift completely. Blakesley ordered Chen to his office that morning. Chen expected punishment for unauthorized modifications. Instead, Blakesley asked him how quickly he could build 20 more systems. Chen said he needed components, assistance, and official authorization. Blakesley said he would handle authorization. Chen should focus on components and timeline. The problem was supply. Chen had built his prototype using salvage parts from damaged aircraft. Building 20 systems required new components, standardized designs, quality control procedures. The Army Air Force's supply system moved slowly. Requisitioning specialized radio equipment could take weeks or months. Chen had a different idea. He knew that RAF radar stations use standardized transmitters and receivers. British manufacturers produced those components in quantity for military contracts. If the Americans could obtain British radar components, Chen could adapt them for P-51 installation much faster than waiting for American suppliers. Blakesley contacted RAF Fighter Command directly. He explained Chen's system, Mitchell's successful test, the potential for night interceptions by American fighters. The British response was immediate and enthusiastic. RAF commanders had been losing night battles for 4 years. Any system that could turn day fighters into night fighters deserved maximum support. Within 48 hours, a truck arrived at Debbdon carrying 37 British radar receivers, mounting hardware, antenna components, and technical documentation. The equipment came with 2 RAF technicians who understood the systems completely. Chen suddenly had everything he needed to equip an entire squadron. but installing 20 systems required more than components. Chen needed help. Electrical work on that scale demanded multiple technicians working simultaneously. Blakesley assigned him 8 mechanics from the group maintenance section, men who understood P-51 systems, electrical circuits, antenna installation. Chen would supervise the work and train each team on the specific requirements. The installation process took 6 days. Each P-51 required identical modifications. Remove the radio compass, install the radar receiver in its place, run antenna leads through existing cable channels, mount the display unit beside the flight instruments, connect power leads to the aircraft's electrical system, test all connections, and verify signal reception. Chen worked 18-hour days supervising installations, troubleshooting problems, training mechanics on procedures they had never seen before. His hands were permanently stained with electrical compound and metal polish. His eyes burned from studying circuit diagrams by lamplight. His back ached from crawling through aircraft fuselages. But 20 P-51s were being transformed into night fighters. The most challenging part was pilot training. Day fighter pilots understood visual combat. They tracked targets by sight, aimed guns through optical gun sights, judged range and deflection using experience and intuition. Night fighting required completely different skills. Pilots had to interpret radar displays, understand electronic symbology, coordinate with ground controllers who were tracking the same targets from different perspectives. Mitchell became the primary instructor. He had successfully used Chen's system in combat. He understood both the capabilities and limitations. Mitchell developed training procedures based on his single night mission, but he knew that one successful engagement didn't make him an expert. He was learning the system's nuances while teaching other pilots to use it. The training began with ground instruction. Pilots sat in parked aircraft studying the radar display. Chen explained how ground radar painted pictures of the sky, how those pictures were transmitted by radio, how the receiver converted radio signals into visual information on the cockpit display. The technology was revolutionary, but the concepts were straightforward. Understanding the display required practice. Green dots represented aircraft. Numbers showed bearing, range, and altitude. The display updated continuously as aircraft moved. Pilots learned to interpret the symbols, track multiple contacts simultaneously, distinguish between friendly and enemy aircraft based on flight patterns and ground controller information. Night flying presented additional challenges. P-51 pilots were accustomed to daylight operations. They navigated by visual landmarks, maintained formation through visual contact, returned to base using familiar terrain features. Night flying eliminated all visual references. Pilots had to rely completely on instruments, radio navigation, and ground controller guidance. The first night training flights began on March 28. Single aircraft missions with experienced pilots testing the radar system under controlled conditions. No enemy contact expected. Simple navigation exercises to familiarize pilots with night operations and radar interpretation. Mitchell flew the first mission and reported that the system worked exactly as designed. Other pilots followed. Each night, 2 or 3 P-51s took off after sunset to practice radar-guided navigation. They flew predetermined routes while ground controllers tracked their progress. The pilots learned to correlate radar information with actual flight conditions. They developed confidence in the system's accuracy and reliability. By April 2nd, 12 pilots had completed basic night training. They could interpret the radar display, navigate in darkness, communicate effectively with ground controllers. They were ready for operational missions. The only question was whether German bombers would provide targets. The answer came on April 4th. RAF Dover reported a formation of 24 German bombers crossing the French coast at 9:47 p.m. Junkers 88s heading toward London. British Mosquito night fighters were scrambling but wouldn't reach intercept position in time. The bombers would have a clear run to their targets unless American fighters intervened. Blakesley authorized the first operational night mission. 4 P-51s with Chen's radar systems. Mitchell leading, 3 other pilots following. Their mission was to intercept the bomber formation over the channel before it reached London. If successful, they would prove that day fighters could dominate night combat. If unsuccessful, they might lose 4 aircraft and pilots to an untested system. The P-51s took off at 10:03 p.m. Mitchell climbed to 16,000 feet and turned southeast toward the channel. His radar displays showed the bomber formation at bearing 095 degrees, range 67 miles. The other 3 P-51s formed on Mitchell's aircraft, following his lead toward the intercept point. Ground controllers provided continuous updates. The German formation maintained course and altitude. 24 bombers in loose formation, no fighter escort, approaching British airspace at 180 miles per hour. Perfect targets if the American fighters could find them in the darkness. Mitchell reached the intercept area at 10:31 p.m. His radar display showed multiple contacts ahead. The bomber formation was splitting up, individual aircraft taking different headings toward their assigned targets. Standard German procedure for night bombing. Spread out to confuse defenders, converge on London from multiple directions. Mitchell selected the closest target and called his attack to the other P-51s. 4 American fighters dove toward a formation that couldn't see them coming. The German crews expected no interception over the channel. They flew straight and level, maintaining cruise power, conserving fuel for the return flight to France. The attack began at 10:34 p.m. Mitchell opened fire on a Junkers 88 from 400 yards range. His tracers walked up the bomber's fuselage and into the cockpit. The aircraft exploded immediately. Orange flames lit the darkness as burning debris tumbled toward the channel. The other P-51s engaged simultaneously. 3 more Junkers caught fire within seconds. The coordinated attack devastated the bomber formation. Surviving aircraft scattered in all directions, some turning back toward France, others climbing desperately to escape the unseen fighters. But Mitchell's flight wasn't finished. They had radar guidance and unlimited ammunition. Each P-51 pursued individual targets, hunting bombers that were trying to escape in the darkness. The radar displays showed exactly where each enemy aircraft was located. There was no hiding in the night sky. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. 4 P-51s destroyed 9 German bombers and damaged 6 others. The remaining bombers abandoned their mission and fled toward France. London would not be bombed that night. The Luftwaffe's first encounter with radar-guided American night fighters had been catastrophic. Mitchell's flight returned to Debbdon at 11:28 p.m. Ground crews counted ammunition expended and fuel consumed. Intelligence officers debriefed each pilot individually. The results were unprecedented. 9 confirmed kills, 6 probables, 0 American losses. The most successful night interception in aviation history. But the real victory was psychological. German bomber crews had considered darkness their absolute protection. No fighter could find them in the black sky over the channel. Night bombing was safe bombing. That assumption had been shattered in 14 minutes of radar-guided combat. Luftwaffe intelligence analyzed the engagement reports from surviving bomber crews. American fighters had appeared from nowhere, attacked with precision, disappeared into darkness. The fighters had demonstrated perfect knowledge of German positions and movements. Some form of night fighting technology was clearly involved. German commanders faced an uncomfortable reality. If American day fighters could hunt effectively at night, then no German aircraft was safe after sunset. The Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign against London would become suicide missions. The strategic equation of night warfare had changed completely. The German response was swift and desperate. On April 6, Oberst Heinrich Weiss stood in the operations room at Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, studying intelligence reports from the Channel engagement 2 nights earlier. Weiss commanded night bomber operations for the entire Western Front. He had overseen 4 years of successful night attacks against British cities. He had never seen losses like this. 9 bombers destroyed in 14 minutes, 6 more damaged beyond repair, 15 aircraft lost from a single formation. The surviving crews reported coordinated attacks by multiple fighters, American fighters, P-51 Mustangs, that had appeared from complete darkness with perfect positioning and timing. Weiss understood the implications immediately. American day fighters hunting at night meant the end of German night bombing operations. His carefully trained crews, his expensive aircraft, his strategic bombing campaign, everything depended on darkness for protection. If that protection no longer existed, the entire night war would collapse. The intelligence reports offered few details. Surviving German crews described sudden attacks by unseen fighters, tracers appearing from empty sky, coordinated engagements that suggested the Americans knew exactly where each bomber was located. Some form of radar guidance seemed certain, but how were single-engine fighters getting radar information? Weiss called his technical intelligence officer, Major Franz Kellner. Kellner had analyzed British night fighter capabilities for 3 years. He understood radar technology, aircraft modifications, electronic warfare systems. If anyone could explain how American day fighters were hunting at night, it was Kellner. Kellner studied the combat reports carefully. The attack patterns suggested multiple fighters with independent targeting information, not formation attacks where wingmen followed a leader, individual engagements where each pilot selected his own target. That implied each aircraft had its own source of targeting data. British Mosquito night fighters carried onboard radar systems, large, heavy equipment that required specialized installation and trained radar operators. P-51 Mustangs were single-seat fighters with no room for radar equipment or operators, yet they were demonstrating radar-guided interception capabilities. The contradiction made no technical sense. Kellner proposed a theory. Perhaps the Americans weren't carrying radar equipment at all. Perhaps they were receiving targeting information from ground-based radar stations. British coastal radar could track German formations crossing the channel. If that information could be transmitted to fighters by radio, single-engine aircraft could hunt without carrying heavy radar systems. The concept was ingenious in its simplicity. Ground radar painted the picture. Radio transmitted the picture. Fighters received the picture and used it for interception. No onboard radar required. No trained operators needed. Just pilots with radio receivers and targeting displays. Weiss realized the strategic disaster this represented. Every German night mission would face radar-guided interception. American fighters would know the position, altitude, heading, and speed of every German bomber crossing the channel. Night bombing would become organized suicide. The Luftwaffe had three options: abandon night operations entirely, develop countermeasures against the American system, or overwhelm the defenses with massive formations that could absorb heavy losses and still reach their targets. None of the options were acceptable. Meanwhile, at RAF Debbdon, Colonel Blakesley was dealing with a different problem. Chen's radar system worked perfectly, but success was creating demand that exceeded supply. Every fighter group in the 8th Air Force wanted the modification. Bomber Command wanted escort fighters that could protect night missions. Coastal Command wanted interceptors that could hunt German reconnaissance aircraft in darkness. Blakesley received requests for technical information from 17 different units in 4 countries. American, British, Canadian, and Free French commanders all wanted to know how P-51s were hunting at night. The simple radio receiver that Chen had built in 3 days was becoming the most requested piece of equipment in the European theater. The problem was production capacity. Chen's team could install maybe 4 systems per day, working around the clock. The 8th Air Force had over 800 P-51s that could potentially receive the modification. At current installation rates, equipping the entire fighter force would take 6 months. The war couldn't wait that long. General Jimmy Doolittle commanded the 8th Air Force. He had led the famous raid on Tokyo, understood innovative tactics, appreciated unconventional solutions to tactical problems. When Blakesley briefed him on Chen's system, Doolittle immediately ordered maximum priority production. Doolittle contacted Wright Field in Ohio, where Army Air Forces engineers developed and tested new equipment. He wanted Chen's radar receiver reverse-engineered, standardized, and put into immediate production. The modification would become official equipment instead of field-expedient installation. Wright Field engineers arrived at Debbdon on April 8th. They studied Chen's system, analyzed the circuit design, tested the performance characteristics. The lead engineer, Major Robert Stevens, had developed radar equipment for the Navy before transferring to the Army Air Forces. He understood what Chen had accomplished. Stevens called Chen's work brilliant engineering under impossible constraints. The circuit design was elegant. The installation was professional. The performance exceeded anything Wright Field had achieved with similar equipment. Stevens recommended immediate adoption as standard equipment for all P-51 squadrons. But standard adoption required standard production. Wright Field couldn't manufacture Chen's hand-built receivers fast enough to meet demand. The system needed redesign for mass production, component standardization, quality control procedures, engineering work that would take months while German bombers continued attacking British cities every night. Chen had a different suggestion. Instead of redesigning his system for American production, why not use British manufacturing? RAF radar equipment was already in mass production at factories across England. British components were standardized, tested, readily available. American fighters could use British radar receivers with minor modifications. Stevens studied the concept and agreed. British radar manufacturers could deliver receivers faster than American factories could gear up for production. The components were compatible with Chen's design. Quality was proven through years of RAF service. Using British equipment made perfect tactical and logistical sense. The procurement process moved with wartime speed. Stevens contacted British Ministry of Aircraft Production on April 9th. By April 12th, contracts were signed for 400 radar receivers per week. British factories would produce the equipment. American maintenance crews would install it. RAF technicians would provide training and technical support. Installation teams deployed to every P-51 base in England. Mechanics who had learned Chen's procedures at Debbdon became instructors at other airfields. The modifications spread from squadron to squadron across the entire fighter command. By April 20th, over 200 P-51s carried night fighting equipment. Pilot training expanded simultaneously. Mitchell's night fighting procedures became standard curriculum at every fighter base. Ground school covered radar interpretation, radio procedures, night navigation techniques. Flight training included practice intercepts, formation flying in darkness, emergency procedures for night operations. The results appeared immediately. German night bomber losses increased dramatically as more American fighters joined the night battle. Luftwaffe formations that had once attacked British cities with impunity now faced coordinated interception by radar-guided fighters. The night sky over England became as dangerous as daylight combat. On April 18th, the largest night engagement of the war took place over the Channel. 57 German bombers attempted a massive raid on London. 32 P-51s with Chen's radar system intercepted them. The battle lasted 43 minutes and covered 120 square miles of dark sky. American fighters destroyed 28 German bombers and damaged 17 others. Only 12 bombers reached London, and their bombing was scattered and ineffective. German losses exceeded 50%. No American fighters were lost. The engagement demonstrated that radar-guided day fighters could dominate night combat completely. Luftwaffe command recognized the strategic defeat. Night bombing operations against Britain were suspended indefinitely. Remaining bomber units transferred to other theaters where American night fighters weren't active. The 4-year campaign of terror bombing British cities was over. But Chen's innovation had implications beyond night fighting. The concept of ground-to-air data transmission opened possibilities that no one had considered. If radar information could be sent to fighters, what other information could be transmitted? Weather data, navigation updates, target identification, friendly aircraft positions, threat warnings, all could be sent by radio to aircraft in flight. The system Chen had built to solve a specific tactical problem became the foundation for modern air-to-ground data links. Every military aircraft today receives information from ground stations through systems that evolved from Chen's 11-pound radio receiver. The principles he established in 1944 guide military aviation communications 7 decades later. American aircraft manufacturers studied the installation procedures and incorporated similar systems into new production aircraft. The P-51H model included factory-installed night fighting equipment based on Chen's design. The P-80 jet fighter carried advanced versions of the same concept. Even bomber aircraft received modifications that allowed ground stations to transmit targeting information directly to bombardiers. British manufacturers developed their own versions for RAF aircraft. The Meteor jet fighter included ground link receivers. The Lincoln bomber carried equipment that could receive weather updates and navigation corrections during flight. Post-war aircraft like the Hunter and Javelin incorporated even more sophisticated systems. Soviet intelligence obtained technical details of Chen's system through various sources and developed their own versions for Red Air Force aircraft. The MiG-15 included basic ground link capability. Later aircraft like the MiG-21 carried advanced systems that could receive targeting data, navigation updates, and threat warnings from ground stations. The psychological impact on German aircrew was devastating. Night flying had been their sanctuary, their one advantage over Allied air power. German pilots were better trained for night operations. German aircraft were designed for night combat. German tactics exploited darkness effectively. All of those advantages disappeared when Allied fighters could hunt with radar guidance. Luftwaffe morale collapsed as night losses mounted. Bomber crews refused to fly missions they considered suicide. Fighter pilots avoided night operations where possible. Even transport aircraft switched to daylight schedules despite increased vulnerability to Allied fighters. The German Air Force was conceding the night sky completely. American intelligence intercepted German communications discussing the night fighting crisis. Luftwaffe commanders described the situation as hopeless. They could not counter radar-guided interception with existing equipment. They could not replace aircraft losses at current rates. They could not maintain night operations against such effective opposition. Some German units attempted countermeasures. Electronic jamming equipment was installed in bomber aircraft to disrupt Allied radar. Decoy formations were used to confuse ground controllers. Flight patterns were randomized to prevent predictable interceptions. None of these measures proved effective against the American system. The fundamental problem was that Chen's receivers were passive. They detected transmissions but didn't transmit anything themselves. German electronic warfare equipment was designed to jam active radar systems that sent out signals. Passive receivers that only listened couldn't be jammed by conventional methods. German attempts to locate and attack the ground radar stations also failed. British coastal radar was heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns and fighter patrols. The stations were dispersed across hundreds of miles of coastline. Destroying enough stations to create gaps in coverage would have required resources the Luftwaffe couldn't spare. By May 1944, German night bomber operations against Britain had essentially ceased. Occasional small raids attempted to maintain pressure, but losses were unsustainable. The strategic bombing campaign that had terrorized British civilians for 4 years was defeated by a radar receiver built from salvaged parts in a maintenance hangar. Chen received official recognition for his innovation in June 1944. The Distinguished Service Medal citation praised his technical brilliance and tactical insight, but Chen was more interested in the operational results than personal recognition. His system was saving Allied lives and winning the night war. The modification continued spreading to other theaters. P-51 units in Italy received the equipment and began hunting German night intruders over the Mediterranean. Pacific theater commanders requested similar systems for operations against Japanese night bombers. Even transport aircraft and bombers were modified to receive ground-transmitted information. Production expanded beyond British factories. American manufacturers began producing compatible equipment under license. Canadian and Australian factories joined the program. By late 1944, ground-to-air data transmission was standard capability for most Allied military aircraft. The system's success led to rapid technological advancement. Early versions like Chen's prototype could receive basic targeting information. Later versions transmitted weather data, navigation updates, identification codes, and tactical intelligence. The simple radio receiver had become a comprehensive information system. Training programs expanded to match the technology. Pilots learned to interpret multiple data streams simultaneously. Ground controllers developed procedures for managing dozens of aircraft receiving information from the same stations. Maintenance crews specialized in the increasingly complex electronic systems, but the core principle remained unchanged. Ground stations collected information, radio transmitted information, aircraft received information, and used it for tactical advantage. Chen's elegant solution to a specific problem had created an entirely new category of military capability. The German surrender in May 1945 ended European combat operations, but Chen's system continued evolving. Post-war development focused on peacetime applications. Commercial aviation adopted similar concepts for weather reporting and navigation assistance. The technology that had defeated German night bombers became part of everyday flight operations. Military applications expanded during the Cold War. Fighter aircraft received increasingly sophisticated data links that could transmit targeting information, threat warnings, and tactical intelligence. Bomber aircraft got systems that could receive mission updates and target changes during flight. Transport aircraft could obtain weather reports and routing instructions automatically. Chen remained in the Air Force after the war, working on electronic systems development at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He contributed to early computer development, satellite communication systems, and digital data processing. His career spanned the transition from vacuum tubes to integrated circuits, but his most famous innovation remained the simple receiver he built in 1944. The night fighting modification he created became the ancestor of every military data link system in service today. Modern fighter aircraft receive vast amounts of information from ground stations, satellites, and other aircraft through systems that trace their lineage directly to Chen's salvage components and hand wound coils. Commercial aviation adopted similar concepts for air traffic control, weather reporting, and navigation assistance. Every airliner today receives information from ground stations through systems based on principles Chen established. The technology that defeated Luftwaffe night bombers guides millions of passenger flights safely to their destinations. Chen's modification program faced its most challenging test on May 3, 1944, when German intelligence finally identified the source of American night fighting success. Oberst Heinrich Weiss had spent weeks analyzing combat reports, interviewing surviving bomber crews, studying American radio intercepts. His conclusion was devastating for Luftwaffe operations but crucial for understanding how to counter the threat. The Americans weren't carrying complex radar systems. They were receiving targeting data from British coastal radar stations through simple radio receivers. The elegance of the solution impressed even German engineers. Instead of mounting heavy equipment in single-seat fighters, they had turned every P-51 into a remote display for ground-based radar. The concept was revolutionary and nearly impossible to counter with conventional electronic warfare. Weiss presented his findings to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring on May 5. The meeting took place in Berlin, in a bunker deep beneath the Air Ministry building. Allied bombing had driven German command underground. The irony was not lost on Weiss that he was briefing the head of the Luftwaffe about night fighting while hiding from Allied night bombers. Göring listened to Weiss's analysis with growing frustration. The Americans had solved night interception using British radar and salvaged radio parts. Meanwhile, German engineers had spent 3 years developing complex airborne radar systems that were too heavy for single-engine fighters. The enemy had achieved superior results with simpler technology and better tactical thinking. The German response revealed fundamental misunderstanding of Chen's system. Luftwaffe engineers engineers began developing electronic jammers designed to disrupt the radio links between ground stations and fighters. They assumed the data transmission used conventional radio frequencies that could be blocked with powerful transmitters. The jammers were massive, complex devices that required dedicated aircraft to carry them, but Chen's receivers operated on frequencies the Germans hadn't identified. British radar stations could transmit targeting data on any of dozens of different channels. The Americans simply switched frequencies when jamming appeared. German jamming aircraft became targets for the same fighters they were trying to disrupt. The countermeasures failed completely while consuming resources the Luftwaffe couldn't afford. More sophisticated German attempts focused on attacking the ground radar stations directly. Special operations teams were inserted along the British coast with orders to sabotage radar installations. The missions were disasters. British security around radar sites was impenetrable. Most German agents were captured before reaching their targets. Those who succeeded in approaching the stations discovered that destroying one radar site had no effect on the overall system. The fundamental problem was redundancy. British coastal radar consisted of dozens of stations covering overlapping areas. Destroying one station simply shifted coverage to adjacent sites. The Americans could continue receiving targeting data, even if several stations went offline simultaneously. German sabotage efforts required precision and resources that exceeded their capabilities. By late May, Luftwaffe night operations against Britain had virtually ceased. The few bombers that still attempted raids flew individually, at random times, using unpredictable routes. They avoided formation flying that made them easy targets for radar-guided interception. The strategic bombing campaign had devolved into nuisance attacks that achieved no meaningful military objectives. American success with night fighting created demand for similar capabilities in other theaters. General Curtis LeMay commanded the 20th Air Force in the Pacific, where Japanese night bombers were attacking Allied bases across the theater. LeMay requested immediate deployment of Chen's system for defending strategic airfields and protecting B-29 bases in the Mariana Islands. The Pacific deployment required modifications to Chen's original design. British coastal radar coverage didn't exist in the Pacific. American forces would need to establish their own ground radar network to support night fighting operations. Mobile radar units were shipped from England, along with technicians trained on the system. Installation began on Saipan in June 1944. American engineers erected radar stations around the perimeter of the island, providing 360-degree coverage out to 100 miles. P-51s based on the airfield received Chen's modification using equipment manufactured in Britain and shipped across the Pacific. The first Pacific night interceptions took place on June 23rd. Japanese night bombers had been attacking Saipan regularly since American forces captured the island. Twin-engine Betty bombers crossed from bases on Guam and Tinian, dropped their bombs, and disappeared into the darkness. American night fighters had been ineffective against these raids. The installation of radar-guided interception changed the tactical situation immediately. The first Pacific engagement occurred at 11:47 p.m. when radar detected 4 Japanese bombers approaching from the southeast. 2 P-51s with Chen's system took off and intercepted the formation 30 miles from Saipan. The Japanese crews had no warning before American fighters appeared from the darkness. All 4 bombers were destroyed within minutes. No bombs fell on American positions. Japanese intelligence struggled to understand the sudden effectiveness of American night fighters. Like their German counterparts, Japanese commanders assumed the Americans had developed new airborne radar technology. They began working on countermeasures for equipment that didn't actually exist aboard the attacking aircraft. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrew was severe. Night bombing had been their most effective tactic against American bases. Japanese pilots were experienced in night operations. Their aircraft were designed for nighttime missions. American fighters had been unable to intercept them effectively. Suddenly, that advantage had disappeared completely. Japanese night bomber losses mounted rapidly as more American bases received the radar-guided interception capability. Bases on Tinian, Guam, and Iwo Jima were equipped with ground radar stations and modified P-51s. Japanese bombers faced coordinated interception throughout the Central Pacific. Night raids became suicide missions with minimal chance of success. The expansion of Chen's system created logistical challenges that threatened the entire program. British factories were producing radar receivers at maximum capacity, but demand exceeded supply by substantial margins. American factories were beginning production under license agreements, but manufacturing hadn't reached full capacity. Installation teams were working around the clock, but couldn't keep pace with requests from combat units. General Henry Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, made Chen's system a top priority for production and deployment. Arnold understood that night fighting capability provided strategic advantages that extended far beyond tactical engagement. engagements. Control of night skies meant protection for Allied bomber bases, security for supply operations, and denial of darkness to enemy forces. Arnold ordered acceleration of American production through contracts with multiple manufacturers. Radio Corporation of America, General Electric, and Westinghouse received orders for radar receivers based on Chen's specifications. The production goal was 500 units per week by September 1944. Meeting that goal required retooling factories and training workers on entirely new manufacturing processes. Installation training expanded beyond individual bases to theater-wide programs. Chen was promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned to develop standardized procedures for system installation and maintenance. His training teams deployed to every major American air base in Europe and the Pacific. The knowledge he had gained working alone in a Debbdon hangar became curriculum for thousands of maintenance personnel. Pilot training evolved from Mitchell's basic procedures into comprehensive night fighting doctrine. The Army Air Forces established specialized schools for night interception tactics. Pilots learned radar interpretation, radio procedures, night navigation, and formation flying in darkness. The curriculum included both technical instruction and tactical development. Combat results validated the training investment. American night fighters achieved kill ratios that exceeded daylight engagements. Radar-guided interception eliminated the element of surprise that had protected enemy night bombers. American pilots could see enemy formations long before visual contact became possible. They could position for optimal attacks while remaining invisible to their targets. The success of night interception operations led to expansion beyond defensive missions. American commanders began planning offensive night attacks against enemy airfields, supply routes, and communication centers. P-51s with Chen's system could hunt for targets in enemy territory using intelligence provided by ground stations and reconnaissance aircraft. The first offensive night missions took place over France in July 1944. American fighters used radar guidance to locate German transport aircraft supplying isolated garrisons. The missions were devastatingly effective. German supply flights that had operated safely under cover of darkness suddenly faced coordinated interception. Transport losses became unsustainable. German attempts to protect their supply flights led to night fighter engagements between American P-51s and German night fighters. The encounters revealed another advantage of Chen's system. American fighters could coordinate their attacks using information from ground controllers, while German pilots relied on visual contact and individual initiative. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. American fighters operating with radar guidance could maintain formation in complete darkness, execute coordinated attacks, and avoid friendly fire incidents. German night fighters operating independently often interfered with each other and occasionally engaged friendly aircraft by mistake. By August 1944, German night fighter operations had become as ineffective as their bomber operations. American radar-guided interception dominated night combat in every theater where the system was deployed. The Luftwaffe conceded night operations entirely, concentrating remaining resources on daylight missions that were becoming equally hopeless. Chen's innovation had achieved strategic impact far beyond its original tactical purpose. The simple radio receiver built to solve a specific night interception problem had revolutionized air combat across multiple theaters. Enemy forces that had relied on darkness for protection found themselves as vulnerable at night as during daylight hours. The system's influence extended beyond immediate combat applications. Military planners recognized that ground-to-air data transmission could support operations other than interception. Weather information, navigation updates, target identification, and intelligence reports could all be transmitted to aircraft during flight. Chen's concept became the foundation for comprehensive airborne information systems. Post-war development accelerated as military services recognized the potential for expanded applications. The Air Force established dedicated research programs for air-to-ground data links. The Navy developed similar systems for carrier-based aircraft. Even the Army explored applications for observation and liaison aircraft operating with ground forces. Commercial aviation showed interest in adapted versions of the technology. Airlines needed reliable methods for transmitting weather information and routing changes to aircraft during flight. The Federal Aviation Administration began studying applications for air traffic control and navigation assistance. Chen's military innovation was evolving into civilian infrastructure. International cooperation expanded the system's reach beyond American and British forces. Canadian and Australian air forces adopted compatible equipment for their combat aircraft. Free French and Polish squadrons received training on night interception procedures. The technology spread throughout the Allied coalition, providing common capabilities for coordinated operations. The war's end in 1945 marked the beginning of Chen's system's evolution into peacetime applications. Military requirements shifted from combat operations to training exercises and patrol missions. The emphasis changed from destroying enemy aircraft to supporting navigation, communication, and safety operations. The fundamental technology remained valuable even without active combat. Chen received permanent assignment to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where he continued developing electronic systems for military aviation. His post-war projects included early computer applications, satellite communication concepts, and digital data processing systems. The experience gained building radio receivers from salvaged parts prepared him for the electronic revolution that would transform military technology. The radar receiver modification he had created in a maintenance hangar became the ancestor of every modern military data link system. Fighter aircraft today receive targeting information, threat warnings, and intelligence updates through systems that evolved directly from Chen's innovation. The principles he established in 1944 continue guiding military aviation communications 8 decades later. But Chen's greatest contribution wasn't technological advancement. It was demonstrating that innovative solutions could emerge from unexpected sources under extreme pressure. A radar technician working alone with salvaged components had solved a strategic problem that had stymied military engineers for years. His success proved that breakthrough innovations often came from practical experience rather than theoretical research. The lesson resonated throughout the military establishment. Field modifications and local innovations received more attention from higher command levels. Technical personnel were encouraged to experiment with solutions to operational problems. The rigid hierarchy that had previously discouraged unauthorized modifications was relaxed to promote creative problem-solving. Chen's story became part of Air Force tradition, told in technical schools and officer training programs. It illustrated the importance of recognizing good ideas regardless of their source. It demonstrated that strategic advantages could emerge from tactical innovations. Most importantly, it showed that individual initiative could change the course of entire campaigns. The night fighting system he created represented more than technological achievement. It exemplified the American approach to warfare that emphasized innovation, adaptation, and practical solutions over rigid doctrine. Chen had identified a problem, developed a solution, and implemented it successfully despite regulatory obstacles and institutional resistance. His success encouraged similar initiatives throughout the armed forces. Other technical personnel began proposing modifications and improvements based on operational experience. The culture of innovation that emerged during World War II continued shaping military development for decades afterward. Chen's example proved that breakthrough capabilities could emerge from unexpected sources when creative individuals were empowered to solve critical problems. The success of Chen's night fighting system created an unexpected problem that threatened to undermine the entire program. By September 1944, American radar-guided interception had become so effective that German night bombers rarely appeared over Britain. The few aircraft that still attempted raids flew individually at unpredictable times, avoiding the formation flights that had made them vulnerable to coordinated attacks. Without regular enemy activity, newly trained night fighter pilots couldn't gain combat experience. They understood the technology and procedures, but lacked the practical skills that came only from actual engagements. Training flights against friendly aircraft provided technical proficiency, but couldn't replicate the stress and uncertainty of hunting enemy bombers in hostile airspace. Squadron commanders faced a dilemma. They had pilots trained for night interception, but no targets to intercept. They had sophisticated equipment installed in hundreds of aircraft, but limited opportunities to use it operationally. The very success of the system had eliminated the conditions necessary for continued pilot development. Colonel Blakesley proposed a solution that would expand the system's applications beyond defensive interception. American forces were advancing across France toward Germany. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles behind the front lines. German forces were using darkness to move supplies, equipment, and reinforcements without interference from Allied air power. Night interdiction missions could disrupt these movements while providing combat experience for radar-equipped fighters. The concept required modifying Chen's system for offensive operations. Defensive interception relied on ground radar to track incoming enemy formations. Offensive missions needed different information sources. Intelligence reports, reconnaissance data, and target coordinates would replace radar contacts as primary information sources. The display system required redesign to show ground targets instead of airborne contacts. Chen worked with intelligence officers to develop procedures for transmitting target information to aircraft during flight. Ground stations could broadcast coordinates for supply convoys, troop movements, and transportation hubs. Fighters would receive this information through their radar receivers and use it to locate targets in enemy territory. The same technology that had guided interceptions could guide ground attacks, The first night interdiction missions launched from Debbdon on September 12. Four P-51s received target coordinates for German supply convoys moving through the Ardennes forest. The fighters used their modified radar systems to navigate to the target area in complete darkness. Ground controllers provided updates on convoy positions based on intelligence reports and reconnaissance observations. The mission achieved complete surprise. German supply convoys had been moving safely at night for months without interference from Allied fighters. They used minimal blackout procedures and maintained predictable schedules. American fighters appeared from darkness and destroyed 12 vehicles before the convoy could take evasive action. The attack demonstrated that night interdiction could be as effective as night interception. German reaction was immediate and desperate. Supply movements shifted to daylight hours despite increased vulnerability to Allied air attack. Transportation schedules became irregular and unpredictable. Convoy routes changed frequently to avoid established patterns. The changes disrupted German logistics more effectively than daylight bombing had achieved. American night interdiction expanded rapidly as more squadrons received training and equipment. Targets included railroad yards, bridges, communication centers, and fuel depots. The missions provided combat experience for pilots while supporting ground operations through disruption of enemy supply lines. Night fighting had evolved from defensive necessity into offensive capability. The psychological impact on German forces was severe. Darkness had been their refuge from overwhelming Allied air power. Night movements had been safe from air attack. Supply operations could proceed without fighter interference. The appearance of American night fighters eliminated that sanctuary completely. German ground forces felt exposed and vulnerable 24 hours per day. Intelligence reports captured the German perspective through intercepted communications. Unit commanders complained about constant air attack threats. Supply officers reported difficulty maintaining regular delivery schedules. Transportation personnel requested additional anti-aircraft protection for night movements. The American night fighting program was creating systemic disruption throughout German military operations, but offensive night missions revealed limitations in Chen's original system. The radar receivers worked perfectly for displaying airborne targets, but struggled with ground target information. Coordinates transmitted from ground stations appeared as numbers on the display screen. Pilots had to correlate those numbers with their navigation instruments and terrain features. The process was complex and prone to errors during high-stress combat situations. Chen developed an improved display system that could show ground targets graphically instead of numerically. The new design resembled a simplified map with target locations marked as bright dots. Pilots could see their own position relative to targets without complex coordinate calculations. The modification required rewiring the display unit and reprogramming the ground transmission equipment. Installation of the improved displays began in October 1944. The upgrade process took 3 weeks per squadron because each aircraft required individual modification. Chen supervised the work personally, ensuring that every installation met his specifications. The improved system made night interdiction missions more accurate and less demanding for pilots. Combat effectiveness increased immediately after the display upgrade. Pilots could locate targets faster and engage them more precisely. Mission success rates improved from 60% to 85%. The enhanced capability encouraged expansion of night operations to include tactical support for ground forces advancing into Germany. American Army commanders requested air support for night operations crossing the Rhine River. Traditional close air support required daylight for target identification and coordination with ground forces. Night support missions needed different procedures and capabilities. Chen's system could potentially provide the necessary coordination through radio communication with ground controllers. The first night close air support mission took place on October 28 near Aachen. German forces were counterattacking American positions under cover of darkness. Ground controllers used radio to transmit target coordinates to P-51s overhead. The fighters located German positions using their modified radar displays and provided accurate fire support throughout the night engagement. The mission succeeded beyond expectations. German commanders had planned their counterattack assuming no air interference during night hours. American fighters appeared immediately and maintained continuous pressure on advancing German forces. The counterattack collapsed within hours as German units scattered to avoid airstrikes. Night close air support became standard procedure for American ground operations. Infantry commanders could request air support at any hour knowing that radar-equipped fighters could respond effectively in darkness. The capability provided enormous tactical advantages during river crossings, urban combat, and breakthrough operations where speed and surprise were critical. German forces adapted their tactics to account for continuous air threat, but adaptation required sacrificing operational effectiveness. Troop movements became slower and more cautious. Supply operations required extensive anti-aircraft protection. Communication systems needed constant repositioning to avoid airstrikes. The adaptations consumed resources and reduced combat efficiency, throughout German military operations. By November 1944, American night fighting capabilities had expanded far beyond Chen's original concept. What began as defensive interception of enemy bombers had evolved into comprehensive night operations, including interdiction, close air support, and strategic attacks. The simple radio receiver built from salvaged components had become the foundation for revolutionary changes in air warfare. The success attracted attention from other military services. The Navy requested similar capabilities for carrier-based aircraft operating in the Pacific. Marine Corps commanders wanted night support for amphibious operations. Even the Coast Guard explored applications for patrol aircraft conducting search and rescue missions in darkness. Each service had different requirements that demanded modifications to Chen's basic system. Navy aircraft needed equipment compatible with carrier operations and saltwater environments. Marine Corps aircraft required ruggedized systems that could operate from forward airfields with minimal maintenance support. Coast Guard aircraft needed extended range capabilities for ocean patrol missions. Chen established development teams for each service requirement. His original 4-person team at Debbdon expanded to over 40 engineers and technicians working on variations of the basic system. The teams shared technical knowledge while developing specialized applications for different operational environments. Production coordination became increasingly complex as demand exceeded manufacturing capacity across multiple programs. British factories continued producing basic radar receivers, while American manufacturers developed specialized variants. Quality control procedures ensured compatibility between different versions while maintaining performance standards. The logistics of supporting widespread deployment challenged existing supply systems. Spare parts, maintenance manuals, and training materials had to be distributed to bases across multiple theaters. Technical support personnel needed training on different system variants. Installation procedures required standardization while accommodating service-specific requirements. Training programs expanded to match the technology's evolution. Basic radar interpretation courses became comprehensive night operations schools. Pilots learned tactical procedures. Maintenance personnel studied electronic systems. Ground controllers developed coordination techniques. The curriculum covered technical proficiency and operational integration. Combat results validated the training investment across all applications. Night interception, interdiction, close air support, and patrol missions all achieved success rates that exceeded daylight operations in many categories. The combination of surprise, precision, and continuous capability provided overwhelming advantages against enemies who lacked comparable night fighting technology. International cooperation expanded the system's influence beyond American forces. British manufacturers shared production capacity with allied nations. Canadian engineers developed cold weather modifications. Australian technicians created tropical environment adaptations. The technology spread throughout the Allied coalition, with variations suited to different operational requirements. The war's progression toward Germany created new challenges for night operations. German air defenses included radar-guided searchlights and anti-aircraft guns that could track aircraft in darkness. American night fighters needed countermeasures against these defensive systems while maintaining their offensive capabilities against German targets. Chen's team developed electronic warfare equipment that could detect and jam German radar systems. The countermeasures used the same radio principles as the original night fighting system, but reversed the application. Instead of receiving information from friendly sources, the equipment transmitted signals that disrupted enemy radar operations. Integration of offensive and defensive electronic systems created the first comprehensive electronic warfare suites for single-engine fighters. P-51s carried equipment that could receive targeting information from friendly sources while jamming enemy radar systems simultaneously. The capability provided protection from ground-based defenses while maintaining night fighting effectiveness. The electronic warfare development accelerated as German defenses became more sophisticated. Enemy radar systems evolved to counter American jamming techniques. American countermeasures evolved to defeat improved German systems. The technological competition drove rapid advancement in electronic warfare capabilities that would influence military development for decades. By December 1944, night operations had become routine for American air forces throughout Europe. Hundreds of missions launched after sunset every night. Thousands of aircraft carried Chen's modifications or derivatives of his original design. The night sky over Europe was as active as daylight hours, with continuous air operations supporting the advance into Germany. German resistance to night operations collapsed as their defensive capabilities proved inadequate against radar-guided attacks. Luftwaffe night fighters were withdrawn from combat after suffering unsustainable losses. Anti-aircraft defenses were overwhelmed by the volume and precision of American night attacks. German forces conceded night operations entirely and concentrated remaining resources on daylight defense. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate combat results. Control of night skies provided operational tempo that enemy forces couldn't match. American ground operations could continue around the clock with air support. Supply lines remained secure during night hours. Intelligence gathering continued without interruption. The advantages accumulated into overwhelming superiority across all aspects of military operations. David Chen died in 1987 at age 71, buried quietly in Arlington National Cemetery. His obituary mentioned his distinguished military service, his contributions to electronic warfare development, his post-war career at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It did not mention that he had single-handedly ended German night bombing operations with $47 worth of salvaged radio components. It did not mention that every military aircraft flying today carries descendants of the system he built alone in a maintenance hangar. It did not mention that one radar technician's unauthorized modification had changed warfare forever. Sometimes the most important innovations come from the most unexpected places, built by people who simply refused to accept that the problem couldn't be solved.